So this week on the wonderful Fungineering podcast,
Your favorite mycology-based podcast.
I wanted to talk about the science of firearm forensics. So different methods, techniques of how scientists and investigators solve crimes that involve guns.
Cool.
And what the different techniques are, positives and negatives. And it's kind of an interesting topic because I've been in the guns for quite a while. And it's kind of a tangential topic to guns. Like if you own guns and you have fun just going and shooting and stuff, like you may once in a while on the internet run into some interesting article about firearm forensics. And invariably, if you own enough guns, then guns become a political issue for you. They almost have to. And at that point, you have an additional entrance into studying firearms forensics because, surprisingly, the forensics of investigating firearms crimes is itself a political topic.
Why do you feel like if you own enough guns, guns will become a political issue for you?
Because eventually you'll have a friend who owns a suppressor or a machine gun or something like that, or you'll decide you want to buy one, or you'll decide that you want to do something with your gun or with a gun that you may or may not have. And then you'll learn that there's a law against that, or there's some kind of restriction, maybe not an outright prohibition, but a restriction on the thing you want to do. And then you realize you have to become informed about the law. And that instantly leads to the politics of firearms.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it is really hard to become a gun hobbyist for years on end and get into the hobby deeper and deeper and deeper without invariably ending up on the political side of it.
I guess if you're only ever interested in historical reenactment black powder muskets, then you might not ever care.
You might. There are some places that are trying to ban the direct sale of those. So if you remember from our Firearms Law podcast, black powder guns are not really guns if they're muzzle loaded. And so even in a state like California, you can get a muzzle loading rifle shipped to your door without any paperwork. But there are efforts in some of the more liberal states to have things like that curtailed at the state level.
Can I give them to children?
I'm not actually sure. I don't... You know what? You can give them to children. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can I mount them to my car? Okay, now there's all kinds of things I want to do with my black powder muskets.
So something interesting happened about 6 months ago. There's a company that sells suppressors, one of 5 or 6 large companies that makes and sells suppressors in the US. And they released a black powder muzzle loading rifle with a permanently attached suppressor. And because the suppressor is permanently attached, it does not count as a normal suppressor under federal firearms law. Because the rifle is a black powder muzzle loader, it does not count as a firearm. And so you can have this whole package of a muzzle loading black powder suppressed rifle shipped to your door without any paperwork in any state in the US.
How much does it cost?
I never looked it up because I had no interest in it.
I'm a little interested in that. That sounds really fun. Is it well suppressed?
One of the benefits of muzzle loading black powder guns is that you can vary the charge behind the bullet. So potentially you could have a subsonic loading if you just don't put as many of the little capsules of black powder in it. The black powder for most modern muzzle loading rifles comes as these compressed pills, and you put them in the front and then you use the ramrod to press them all the way down. And so you typically put like 2 or 3 of these in. And I wonder if you could put fewer and have it be subsonic, in which case it would suppress really well.
Huh. Okay. Looks like I'm going to be looking up stuff on YouTube after this podcast.
Yeah. All right. So when it comes to firearm forensics, the first big topic that everyone's probably at least aware of is serial numbers on firearms. So since the mid 20th century, all guns manufactured or imported into the United States have to have a serial number on them. And the way this is designed to work is that, let's say you are a police officer and you're at a crime scene and there's a gun laying on the ground. And you pick it up and you look at the various things that are stamped on the side: the make, the model, the manufacturer, and the serial number. And so what you'll do is you'll call up the ATF and you'll give them that information. They'll call the manufacturer and they'll say, hey, we found this particular gun with this serial number. We need to know what distributor you sold it to. So they check their records, they find the distributor, and then the ATF calls that distributor and he says, what retailer did you sell that gun to? They check their records and they find the retailer. And then they call the retailer and they say, who is the person who bought that gun from you? And they say, it's Blake. And so then they call up Blake.
Thanks.
And they'll probably send an agent to his door, or they'll do a little bit of investigation. And they'll be like, Blake's a boring upper middle class white guy who works at a tech company in San Francisco and has no criminal record and has never had a moving violation in his car. It's unlikely that he executed 4 gangbangers in Chicago. Unless he's gone all Judge Dredd suddenly. But they'll do that and they'll be like, okay, so we probably don't need to serve a no-knock warrant on his house, but we'll just go talk to him. So they'll come to Blake's house, or they'll call him, or they'll visit him at work or something. And they'll just be like, hey, we have a gun that was sold to you that was found at a crime scene. And Blake would be like, oh yeah, it was stolen out of my car like a year ago.
What? No, I'll be like, sorry, I'm going to have to get a lawyer before I can speak with you.
Yes, that is the correct response. No matter how innocent you are, that is the correct response. But let's say Blake was dumb and he just decided to try and help the police officer, knowing full well that helping the police has no benefit to you. And so he says, yeah, that was just stolen out of my car. And the police officer basically says, yeah, that sucks. There's nothing really I can do with the serial number. And in reality, that's how the majority of serial number traces end up.
Do you mean specifically the gun was stolen before?
Correct.
Okay.
So there's a government agency called something like the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And according to them, 80% of guns used in crimes are not legally possessed by the perpetrator of that crime. So a serial number on a firearm only allows you to trace the gun to the first retail buyer. So when you go buy a gun in the United States, a new gun from a licensed gun dealer, you do the background check and they record the serial number and all that information. And that's where the trace will end. So if the gun is then stolen from you, the serial number on the gun recovered at the crime scene obviously doesn't link it to the person who committed the crime. So it can be useful in some cases, like if someone is dumb enough to commit a crime with a gun that they bought from a gun dealer and did a background check on.
And they leave it at the crime scene, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is you have to already have the gun.
Yeah.
So, depending on the type of crime that's occurred, you may or may not expect to have the gun anyway, or if you have the gun, you may expect that you would have a bunch of other evidence too.
So, if you've ever watched, say, The Godfather, I mean, this is maybe unrelated, but one of the bits of advice they give, although I think maybe their gun is like unmarked or untraceable, I don't know, but it's leave the gun at the crime scene. Why would you want to leave the gun at the crime scene, or would you never want to do that?
I can't think of a reason you would ever want to do that, especially in the modern day, because you're likely to leave DNA evidence or fingerprint evidence on the gun. You would think it'd always be better to, throw the gun in a river.
Maybe the goal is to just not have a window where you can get caught with the gun on your person.
Maybe so, but there's kind of a cone of information that expands from a crime. And as long as you can stay outside of it long enough to dispose of the gun, then you're probably okay.
What do you mean by a cone of information?
Oh boy.
The info cone.
Go look it up on Wikipedia.
This is a real thing? You didn't just make it up?
You don't know what cone of information is. Shut up.
Well, I thought you were talking about like relativistic light cones, like that type of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as long as you can commit your crime where the police are outside of your causality, then you can get away with it.
In reality, don't worry about anything Blake just said. All you have to worry about is disposing of a gun quickly.
Okay.
So yeah, this example he brought up from The Godfather, where for some reason they were like, leave the gun at the crime scene. Yeah, I can't think of any reason you would ever want to do that.
Fair enough.
Yeah. To go along, so the other issue is, since the late 90s or so, we've had a lot of shows like CSI, where you have 1 hour to solve the mystery. And in those shows, they kind of misrepresent serial numbers really badly. It's kind of like, found a serial number, question mark, and some magic, caught the crook. And, you know, as you can assume from that first statistic, that 80% of the time that a gun is used in a crime that's not used by the legal owner of the gun, then that means 80% of the time the serial number is useless in trying to investigate the crime. At least 80% of the time. It's actually more than that because there can be other problems. But serial numbers are kind of the most basic case of firearms forensics, and virtually everyone's aware that they exist. But nonetheless, it's illegal to remove the serial number from a gun in the US. It's a federal crime to do that. Now, if you build your own homemade gun, it does not have to have a serial number on it. And in fact, you can build your own homemade gun, and then later, if you decide you don't want that gun anymore, you can sell it to someone. And as long as you comply with all the normal state and federal laws of selling a gun, it still doesn't have to have a serial number when you sell it. But the number of homemade guns in the US, I think, probably rounds to zero. It's kind of a hobby thing that people who already own a ton of guns eventually get into.
Yeah. It also doesn't seem like a thing a criminal would do leading into a crime, especially if you can apparently obtain a stolen gun so easily.
Yeah, stolen guns are very cheap in the US and pretty easy to get. So there was a case in Mexico 3 or 4 years ago now, I would suspect. The federales in Mexico busted up a machine shop run by one of the cartels somewhere in northern Mexico. And when they broke the place up, they found a bunch of CNC milling machines completing partially complete AR-15 lowers that you can buy partially complete in the US. So apparently what these guys were doing were buying these partially complete lowers, smuggling them to Mexico, completing them really quickly on a CNC machine, and then building them into complete rifles in this shop.
Why didn't they just make the receivers themselves too?
It takes a lot more machining steps, and there are a couple machining steps of the lower receiver that a normal 6-axis CNC milling machine cannot do.
Oh, okay.
So you do need a much more capable machine shop. Mainly it's cutting the magazine well on an AR-15 receiver. Requires a special machine to do it correctly.
Okay.
So another topic I'd like to touch on before I go into other types of forensics is calibers of guns. So because I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit mixed in with the rest of these subjects. So the caliber of a gun refers to the size and shape of the bullet and the bullet casing that it uses. So if you live in the US and you have a handgun, it's probably in a caliber like 22 long rifle, 9mm, 45 ACP, 40 Smith & Wesson, 38 special, something like that. So what each of those designates is a standard for the geometry of the shell casing and the total length of the loaded shell casing with the bullet inside of it. And you can have different bullet sizes within one caliber. For instance, with 9mm, all 9mm bullets will have the same geometrically similar shell casing, but the bullet may be 115 grains in mass. It may be 126 or 147 or 165 grains. And so those different bullet weights will exist within one caliber. But all of those bullet weights even have the same diameter. So if you were to measure them with an instrument, you would find that all of them measure to 357 thousandths of an inch, which is not quite 9mm, I think. So the thing about calibers is that their names don't follow any kind of pattern. There's no standards for names. There's many, many types of patterns for names that they follow, like 9mm. But just simply saying 9mm doesn't say a lot, because there are a lot of different calibers that have bullets with a diameter of 357 thousandths of an inch, like 38 Smith & Wesson, 9mm Luger, 9x18 Makarov, 9x17, 9x23. There are a whole bunch of different calibers that use that same diameter bullet. So when I'm talking about caliber, I'm talking about a whole different standard of bullet. But then when I'm talking about diameter, I'm simply talking about the measurement of the diameter of the bullet within a certain caliber.
Is 357 also one of these?
Yeah, 357 Magnum. Yes.
Okay.
So that's a good thing to clear up, because we'll be talking a lot about calibers and diameters here in a few minutes. In forensic science, there's this large subject called tool mark analysis. And what tool mark analysis seeks to do is match a tool that worked on some item to the item uniquely. And a very common example of this is when they're investigating bombers. They may have a suspect, and they'll search his house, and they'll find all the pairs of pliers and wire cutters and things like that in their house. And then they'll take actual pieces of wire from a detonated device that they suspect that person built, and they send that to a tool mark analyst, and he will use those tools on new samples of wire that are similar to those recovered from the detonated device, and see what kind of unique marks those tools make. Because when those tools were made, they were given certain unique marks themselves, which they transfer to wires that they cut. And so tool mark analysis works for things like saws and pliers and wrenches, and even like screwdrivers. And anytime you have a harder metal tool working on a softer metal, you have the potential to create unique tool marks that an analyst can use to identify the exact tool that made those marks. And a lot of forensic techniques that are used on firearms are subsets of tool mark analysis. It just happens that the tool is typically the gun, and the item that was operated on by that tool is either a shell casing or a bullet. So the first big one that's used the most is analysis of bullets themselves that are recovered at crime scenes. So you may have a bullet that was recovered during an autopsy from someone who was killed, or you may have a bullet that's pulled out of a wall in a home after a shooting, something like that. You can take this bullet and you can examine it. And similarly, you could take a gun that you may suspect fired that bullet, and you would have a analyst fire that gun into a tank of water to catch the bullet it fires, and then you would compare the rifling marks on those two bullets. So you use this instrument called a comparison microscope. And If you imagine a normal microscope, you put one sample in and you look through the two eyepieces and you magnify the image of the sample. But with a comparison microscope, you put two samples in and you have two separate optical paths that put those images of the two samples next to each other when you look through the eyepieces. And so then you can adjust the optical path of each sample independently so that you look at, say, the back half of one sample and the front half of the other sample right next to each other, and they appear as if they're one continuous item. And then you can try and see if the rifling marks, if you're doing this on bullets, for example, if the rifling marks match up perfectly from one to the other, indicating they were fired from the same gun.
So how would someone defeat this type of analysis?
So there are a lot of problems with this kind of analysis. It's a pretty good method of analysis, and it helps that most criminals are pretty dumb. But the way you would do it is, again, destroy the gun. Don't allow the gun to be recovered. That would be the first way. Because if there's no firearm recovered to create a sample from to compare to a bullet recovered from a crime scene, then there is no comparison. The second thing you could do is try to obliterate the rifling in the gun. So you might do something like take a hard metal rod and just run it up and down the rifling inside the barrel, very rough, and try to create a whole bunch of scratches and gouges in the rifling. That's going to be a little hard because most people don't have hardened metal rods that are small enough just laying around to do that. And by necessity, the rifling of a gun is very hard. You specifically choose metals that are very, very hard to create gun barrels out of so that they last a long time. So that's kind of challenging. You could just destroy the barrel. Maybe if you had a chop saw in your garage, you could just cut the barrel into a bunch of pieces. And then that would make it very difficult. It would probably be impossible to reconstruct it well enough to fire a sample.
Yeah, I would think 2 pieces would be enough.
Maybe so.
I'm guessing that's happened like 0 times in the history of crime.
I bet also. It's more likely that I would bet it's a lot more likely that someone's like, I just got to get rid of this gun, and they throw it in the river.
Yeah.
So another problem with this kind of analysis is it assumes you can recover a bullet. And you can't always recover a bullet. And sometimes when you recover a bullet, it's not useful for this analysis because bullets are typically made of lead. Lead is very soft and it deforms easily. And so if the rifling marks are too deformed by the terminal impact of the bullet, then there's nothing to compare with.
Could you make bullets that didn't receive rifling marks from a barrel?
Yeah, you could. You could just create your own bullets out of a metal that was much harder than the barrel you were using.
Ugh, that'd wreck your gun though, wouldn't it?
Sure, but if you really need to kill somebody, then it's probably worth it.
It doesn't seem worth it.
Still probably easier to just throw the gun in the river, though.
All right, we're going with throwing the gun in the river.
I think you're going to find that's the default answer a lot of the time. I actually cross our local river on my way to work every day, so mail Craig your crime guns and I'll throw them in my river.
Turning any state crime into a federal crime, unless you live in Texas.
Also, just mail me any guns you seek to dispose of, and I'll throw them in the river. Okay, so sometimes this type of analysis can be useful even if you don't have a gun to compare against. So let's say you just recover a bullet at a crime scene and it's in good condition. There's information you can learn from just the bullet related to the rifling. You can learn things from the bullet like what's its diameter? Well, if it's .357, then you can assume it's one of several calibers. If the bullet appears to have remained in one piece, you can weigh it. And let's say it weighs in at 115 grains and it's .357 diameter, then you can be pretty sure that was a 9mm bullet. Furthermore, it has a certain particular number of grooves of rifling imprinted on it. It may be that certain companies use different number of grooves, and that's something very common. Not all companies, even though they may be making guns that are similar, let's say bolt action 22 long rifle guns, even though many gun companies make guns like that, they don't all have the same rifling. And so some may have left hand twist on the rifling and some right hand twist. They may have different number of grooves, and they may have different rifling rates, meaning how quickly or how many times the rifling twists around as it goes down the barrel over a certain length. And so that's the twist rate of the rifling. And so you can deduce all those things if you have a bullet that's in good enough condition.
I know there's different types of rifling. Could they tell the difference between them?
There's basically 3 types of rifling. Let me think of the names. There's polygonal, which is kind of the oddball. So if you imagine a barrel that's just, say, a hexagon shape, anywhere you cut this barrel, its cross section would be a hexagon. But imagine like making a hexagon with your fingers and then moving your hand forward and twisting it. Like that's what the rifling looks like as it goes down the barrel. It's just a hexagon that rotates. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the weird one. The other 2 types are traditional, what's called lands and grooves, denoting the mountains and the valleys in the rifling. And one of those is, I think it's called button rifled. It's the particular method of cutting it. And the other one is cold hammer forged.
Yeah, there's the kind where they like cut the rifling out of the barrel, and the other kind where they hammer the barrel around a rifling.
A mandrel.
Like, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess those would look exactly the same.
I think you end up with a different profile of the mountains in the rifling. Like, do they have tapered trapezoidal edges or do they have straight edges? And I think there may be a difference there, but I don't know that exactly translates through to the rifling marks on the bullet.
Yeah, probably not.
So you can at least tell the difference of whether it was shot from a lands and groove type barrel or a polygonal barrel. And like I said previously, you can find out those other things, the diameter, the twist rate, the number of grooves, and left-handed or right-handed rifling. So there are some cases that have been assisted by information gleaned from that when investigators found all that information and then started searching what kind of guns have all of these characteristics. In a few cases, they've found very unique combinations of characteristics that led them to one particular model of gun, which would then be useful because, say, they had a suspect and they search his house and he owns that particular model of gun. It's very good circumstantial evidence.
This still sounds like all of it can be defeated by throwing your gun in the river.
Yeah, throwing your gun in the river is a pretty solid plan. Okay, so the other part that is subject to tool marks when you shoot a gun is the shell casing. So that's the part that holds the primer and the powder and initially holds the bullet before it's shot. And in a semi-automatic gun, the shell casing is ejected when you fire so that a new one is loaded automatically. But that shell casing has a lot of marks on it. It has marks from the firing pin that struck the primer. It has marks on the rear from the pressure of the explosion inside the casing, pressing it against the breech face of the gun. And so it can receive tooling marks from the breech face. And then it has marks around the circumference of the case, similarly from the pressure pressing it outwards against the chamber of the barrel. So you can end up with a lot of unique information that can help you match it to a particular gun. This kind of analysis, it's interesting. You don't see it used as much. And I really tried to understand, why does shell casing analysis seem to be much less useful? It may be that shell cases are made out of copper, or brass, sorry. it may be that shell casings are made out of brass, and that while they're soft to an extent, they're not nearly as soft as lead. And so they don't absorb as much information in the form of tooling marks. But it's a lot more rare to see shell case analysis actually assist in investigating a crime. A couple of states in the 2000s and the late 90s even, I think, in New York, tried to make databases of shell casings. And so their idea was, if we take every handgun that's sold in the state and we take a shell casing fired from that handgun and we put it in a database, then when we have a crime committed and we recover shell casings from the crime scene, we can similarly scan those, photograph them or whatever, search them against this database and figure out what gun shot it. And potentially, if the gun was shot by the original purchaser, then you have a good suspect.
Yeah, it would only work then, right? Because it'd be like say every bullet just had, or every shell casing had to have the serial number of the gun on it. Then you're at the same place where it's like, well, what if they're stolen?
Exactly. So it immediately falls to the same problem with serial numbers, that most guns used in crimes are stolen to start with, or they're illegally straw purchased, or they're in some way not used by the original buyer.
What's a straw purchase?
A straw purchase is when you have somebody who either cannot legally buy a gun or potentially can legally buy a gun but does not want to have their identity associated with that gun. And so they recruit somebody who can legally buy a gun to go buy it for them. And so in the US, it's a federal crime. Specifically, when you fill out an ATF form 4473 to purchase a gun, there's a question on there that says, are you the actual buyer of this gun? And so what they really want to know is, are you buying this for yourself? Are you the real buyer? And it's kind of a sticky question that people get confused about a lot, because if you're buying a gun as a gift for someone, you are not the actual owner of the gun eventually, but you are the actual purchaser. So that's legal. But if somebody has asked you to purchase a gun for them, that's not legal.
What if they ask you to purchase a gun for them and then give it to them?
Well, if they gave you money in return, then you are not the actual purchaser.
Okay.
But if you gift it to them, you are still the actual purchaser. And that's the important distinction. So yeah, shell case analysis, like you said, it still falls victim immediately to the fact that 80% of guns used in crimes are not used by their lawful owner. So Maryland famously had a shell casing database that it ran from 2000 to 2015. And so the way they implemented this is every handgun sold in Maryland during that time period had to come with a shell casing fired by that gun. And so this created a big logistical problem to start with, right? Because when a manufacturer makes a handgun, he's got no idea what state it'll eventually be sold in. The manufacturers sell to these big distributors, and distributors just sell to retailers. And so what it meant is that every handgun in the United States that was manufactured here was fired by the manufacturer. The shell casing was packaged up with the handgun and sold to a distributor with the shell casing in the box.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. So when you bought your handgun, you had a shell casing in a little manila envelope in the box, right? And it had a serial number on it?
Yeah, I had two.
Oh, two shell casings. That's interesting. Yeah.
Maybe one is for me and one is to take. I don't know. Yeah, I thought that was really strange.
Keep one and give one to a friend.
I was like, what am I going to do with these?
So the reason for that was because of Maryland's shell casing database. And because the dealer in Maryland, the retail dealer, had to submit the casing to the Maryland State Police. And so every handgun sold in the entirety of the United States during that time period had these shell casings in it when you bought them. And similarly, if a company imported a bunch of handguns, the importing company then had to do the test firing and the collection of the shell casings.
Do you think I should take my shell casing and mail it into Maryland so that in case my gun's ever stolen and used in a crime in Maryland, they'll have it?
Well, I'll come to some good reasons in a minute why you shouldn't. So, in all, over that 15-year period, 300,000 handguns were sold to residents of the state of Maryland. And the Maryland State Police collected 300,000 fired shell casings from all these guns. And they were literally stored in a fallout shelter beneath the Maryland State Police headquarters. So there were a lot of technical problems with their database. They never got the image recognition working very well. They never got the database set up where it could handle all the information they were trying to put into it. It was a totally incompetent kind of government contracting type of thing. And so even as far back as 2007, they stopped entering new data into the database. In 2008, they stopped even taking photographs of the shell casings that they were receiving. And so they continued to just store all these little small manila envelopes of shell casings in 55-gallon drums in this fallout shelter. And so they had 3 rooms down in this fallout shelter full of these drums of shell casings. And so...
This is the worst database ever.
Yeah. Well... In all, it solved 0 crimes. So finally in 2015, Maryland abandoned the database. The legislature passed a law allowing the state police to legally stop collecting these and to attempt to try and get rid of all these shell casings, to scrap them. They still haven't done it, though. It cost about $5 million over the course of 15 years, which is pretty amazing. I can't think of how a government program operates for 15 years and spends so little as $5 million. But I guess that's the benefit of it. And at one time, they had 5 full-time officers working at the Maryland State Police headquarters just to catalog and organize the incoming shell casings. But again, according to the Maryland State Police, quote, no crime investigations had been enhanced or expedited, end quote, using this system.
So that means...
in 15 years.
Okay, if I'm doing my math right, on average they were getting something like 60 casings per day to process.
20,000 a year divided by 350-ish. Yeah, so about 60, I guess. Or are we missing a 0?
Does it take 5 guys to process 60 of them?
They're government employees.
That's like 40 hours of work in a day if you have 5 full-time guys. So that means each one is handling 1.5 per hour. That's a lot of lunch breaks and stuff.
I recall now. The article I read about this said they assigned those 5 guys full-time after 2013 when gun sales went through the roof. And so suddenly the rate of handgun sales in Maryland was much higher than the average.
Mm.
And so they had a sudden surge. And they needed these guys to do whatever cataloging there was, even though, 5 years earlier, they had stopped photographing the cases, and a year before that, they had stopped entering data into the database. So I don't really know what the guys were doing down there in the fallout shelter all day.
Playing cards.
Building their pension.
Yes.
So the way the database was intended to work is a crime would be committed, you would find a shell casing at the scene, and then you would consult the database, which would return a gun, and then you would trace the gun to the owner, which you would hope was the shooter. In reality, when it was used, you would have a crime. They would suspect a particular gun or shooter already, and then they would search the database for confirmation. And so they were using it kind of backwards. And by that point, they already had a suspect or they already had a gun recovered. And it wasn't helping them in the direction of finding information that it was intended to.
Mm.
New York State had a similar program for a database like this. They canceled it in 2012 after spending $40 million on it and similarly solving 0 crimes. So it's weird because the database idea seems to really stink. It seems to be really useless. But the analysis of shell casings is useful if you already have a gun that you suspect was used in a crime, and you have a shell casing that is known to come from the crime scene. So that science is really good, but it seems that the database does not enhance that. So that brings us to another similar type of tool mark analysis on shell casings known as microstamping. Have you ever heard of microstamping, Blake?
Yes, I have.
Yes. Can you tell us what microstamping is?
My impression is the serial number of the gun will be written on the firing pin of the gun in the hopes that when the shell casing is left at a crime scene, it'll have the serial number of the gun imprinted on it. And I thought that California passed or was going to pass a law requiring that.
Yes. So you're right. The technical detail of it, the idea is you will have this firing pin, which is what hits the primer to start the reaction to fire a bullet. The firing pin will hit the primer, and the tip of the firing pin will have this microscopic number on it, or some kind of pattern of information. I guess you could do like a QR code or something, but I don't know. And it will leave that imprint on the primer. And the breech face, which is the back wall of the chamber of the gun that the back of the bullet is sitting against, will also have a dye that essentially leaves the same kind of impression against the shell casing itself, the base of the shell casing. So there should be two impressions that are left, one on the primer and one on the shell casing, even though the primer is pressed into the shell casing during manufacture. So it'll have two impressions of the same data. And so, of course, the idea is you fire the gun, the shell casing is expended from the gun and left at the crime scene. And then the kind of like romantic detective version of this is that the detective picks it up at the crime scene and uses his magnifying glass, and he looks at it and he's like, oh yeah, this was gun 112438, and he calls it on the radio, and they're like, Blake owns that gun. And then they go to his house, and it really simplifies crime fighting. It's never been put into practice yet.
Oh, okay.
So as Blake alluded to, California passed a law sometime in 2006, I believe, which said that once microstamping is an available technology, every handgun added to the handgun roster in California has to have microstamping capability. So in California, there's this roster of handguns maintained by the California State Department of Justice, and it's guns that are legal for California regular residents to purchase. Like police officers, I think, don't have to purchase from it, but like regular citizens do. And so it really limits the choice of handguns to California residents. And there were a bunch of legal battles in the late 2000s where there was some intellectual property on microstamping itself that was owned by a gun rights group in California called the Cowguns Foundation. And so they actually owned like some kind of patent or something on it, and they were holding that so that it was not a usable technology. Eventually in 2013, then Attorney General of the state, Kamala Harris, I guess now the junior senator for California, she certified that, hey, microstamping is here. It's a useful technology. So from this date forward in 2013, every new handgun added to the California registry has to be microstamping capable. And to my knowledge, no handguns have been added to the registry or to the roster since 2013.
Doesn't the roster have the side effect of making guns less unique? So when they do all this different profiling, they're less likely to be able to narrow down what gun was used in a crime?
I guess so, but I don't think that would really be a big problem. I mean, it's the kind of thing where, yes, that is technically true, but I don't feel like there are a lot of cases where they're like, oh man, this is unique gun X. We've just solved the crime because of this gun's uniqueness.
Well, imagine a state that only has Glock 17s in it. It's the only gun. Then every bullet and shell casing recovered from every crime scene would be virtually indistinguishable from any other than certain tool markings.
I understand what you say, but I don't agree that that would really inhibit crime fighting or investigation, really.
Okay.
So the situation in California now is that any gun that wants to be added to the roster has to be capable of microstamping. But technology-wise, microstamping is not ready yet. So, to my knowledge, no one's built a gun that is capable of microstamping. There's a lot of problems. Again, it falls to the same problems that serial numbers fall to. Guns used in crimes usually are not traceable to the person using them to begin with. And microstamping would have the same problem. The other issue is you're talking about very, very tiny numbers laser etched onto the tip of a firing pin. So the tip of a firing pin measures probably about a 1/16 of an inch across. And so if you were trying to put several numbers on the tip of the pin, they would be very small and rather delicate. And then you're slamming them into the primer at the base of a cartridge. So it's not exactly an environment conducive to this kind of delicate metalworking. Similarly, a criminal who cared, who was smart enough, could just take a file and rub it against the firing pin once or twice and probably obliterate enough information. Or he could just change the firing pin, because firing pins for most guns cost about $10 or $15 for a replacement, and you can just find a video on YouTube, and in about 20 minutes with sometimes no tools, depending on the type of gun, you can change the firing pin.
But what about the rear breech face?
You could just obliterate that with a file very easily. That would be trivial, because it's simply a flat piece of metal that has a protruding raised serial number added to it. And you just have to destroy that with a file. So that's one that kind of crosses into the political spectrum, because now people who live in California have pretty big restrictions on their selection of handguns because of this forensics technology that is non-existent, or maybe doesn't work, or hasn't really been brought to the market. Even if it is, it's probably easily defeated. It's probably just as bad as shell casing analysis and serial numbers and everything else. It'll have all the same faults that those do. So in some cases, even rifling analysis and casing analysis is unreliable. So you can imagine that if you had a crime that was committed and they recovered a bullet, and the bullet was in good condition, but then say it became a cold case and 10 or 15 years goes by, and then they get some kind of lead and they go back and they investigate more and they have a suspect and they find out he has a gun that may match, and they go and test it. Maybe he shot that gun a lot in the meantime and the rifling has degraded. And similarly, the chamber of a firearm will change over time as you shoot it a lot. The shape of a firing pin can change. It can eventually break and have to be replaced. So all of these items on the gun, the barrel, the chamber, and the firing pin, they're all wear items, meaning they'll wear out over time. If you shoot them enough, you expect to have to replace all of these things. And so in the case where investigations take a long time, you can lose the ability to use that forensic technique.
This sort of assumes the person is the legal owner of the firearm and continues to own it after committing the crime with it, right?
Right. It assumes that he's in that 20% to start with that is the legal owner of the firearm when he uses it, and that he neither throws it in the river nor mails it to Craig to throw in the river. So, do you have any other comments or questions about firearms? I'm going to move on to explosives.
What about fingerprinting gunpowder?
Yeah, that's one of the ones I want to move on to.
Okay.
I think that's an interesting one.
What about criminals that capture their shell casings at the scene?
Okay, so that's a really good question. What about, first off, guns that don't eject shell casings? Things like a break action shotgun. So you can have, imagine Elmer Fudd with his double barreled shotgun. It breaks near the back, and that's where you load two shells in. Or if you played like Doom 2 when you were a kid, and there was the double barrel shotgun in that game, that was a break action double barrel. And so, if you can imagine, you can shoot that gun, you can discharge both barrels, and no shell casings come out until you open the gun up to reload it. Similarly, revolvers don't eject shell casings at all. So, you have to manually eject them literally into your hand, at which point you can just stuff them in your jacket pocket or throw them in the river. So, you can have that problem where there's no shell casing at all to recover. And I guess if you had really robust casing databases and microstamping databases and things like that, if they could iron out all the technical issues with those and get them to become working technologies, maybe you would see. I still don't think it would change criminal activity because, again, 80% of the guns are not traceable to the criminal anyway. So I think that's something only to consider if you're planning to commit a crime with a gun you own. And even then, you should be throwing it in the river.
You also mentioned another thing that I forgot about, but what about doing any of this analysis on shotguns? Like if someone is shot with buckshot, like then what?
Even though part of a shotgun shell is plastic, the base is still brass. And so it'll be subject to tool mark analysis on its base and on the brass part that does extend upwards.
I mean, what about the shot itself? Like, is there much forensic analysis on that?
Oh, yeah. I've never heard of forensic analysis on the shot itself because shotgun barrels are smooth and the shot it's typically still in the shot cup. So the way this works is you have a shotgun shell. It's got a brass base that is maybe a quarter to a half an inch high, depending on the type of shell. And then it has a plastic cylinder that's pressed into that basically makes up the rest of the length of the shell. And that plastic cylinder is crimped over the top to close it. Within that plastic and brass cylinder now, at the bottom, you have powder. And then on top of that, you have something called the shotgun wad. And that is this little like plastic cup with some little legs on it so it can stand up above the powder. And the cup holds the shot. And so when you fire it, often if you're watching, you'll see that plastic cup decelerate and fall in front of you like 20 or 30 feet away because it has very bad aerodynamics. But as it travels down the barrel, all the shots should still be in that plastic cup. So it shouldn't interact with the barrel at all.
So I guess when someone's killed with a break-action shotgun, police are just like, well, that's too bad. And they have to use other avenues to try and solve that crime.
Yeah. I guess you're right. None of these techniques work as long as the person is smart enough to throw it all in the river and not let it be recovered.
Okay, let's hear about explosives now.
Yeah, so it's interesting you asked about gunpowder fingerprinting, because that's a subject I didn't even know about until just a couple of years ago. What gunpowder fingerprinting is this idea that you can manufacture gunpowder like normal. And then you can mix in some kind of unique identifier into the gunpowder. And a good example of this kind of technology is the way a taser works. So when someone fires a taser, every cartridge that's fired from a taser is sold by Taser itself. There is no like aftermarket taser ammo. So every cartridge is sold by Taser. Every cartridge is uniquely serial numbered. Taser keeps track of who buys every cartridge. And when you fire the cartridge from your taser and the two barbs go out and the wire goes out and all of it's projected out from your little taser gun, what also comes out is this cloud of little cardboard discs with the serial number on it of that cartridge. And it's designed to be this kind of, investigative tool in case like some criminal gets a bunch of these cartridges and they bought them legally and registered them with Taser.
And they're using a taser in their crime.
Yeah. And so it sprays out this cloud of cardboard discs with the serial number. And the idea is like any criminal would be unable to, for sure, pick them all up and police his crime scene and clean it all up and then get out. And so gunpowder fingerprinting is a similar kind of technology. The idea is instead of cardboard discs with a serial number, you would have some kind of plastic or cellulose or some kind of thing that would have some kind of unique identifier on it. And the hope would be that after a shooting, you could sweep these up from a crime scene, examine them under a microscope, read the numbers, and then that might lead you back to a particular lot of gunpowder, or maybe things could be done to where it could lead you even down to a particular box of gunpowder. You would have to insert them in a separate step on the manufacturing line. It would complicate manufacturing incredibly. The big danger of this technology, though, is for people who reload. So you have this whole side hobby in the shooting world where you collect your spent brass, you put a new primer in it, you put gunpowder in it, and you load a new bullet in it. And it's basically a way to either save money or create really high quality ammunition for yourself. But when you participate in that hobby, you buy powder in bulk. And so if the powder has this fingerprint material in it, the fear is, and really the actual problem is, that it separates during transport. So now what companies have to do is they have to say, okay, we're going to make this new powder with this fingerprinting additive in it. So we're going to have to come up with new safe recipes for how much powder you put in a casing when you're reloading this ammunition. And then the risk is it separates in transport and you load a cartridge with pure gunpowder with none of the fingerprinting element in it. And it blows up your gun and maybe like hurts your hand or like blows your eye out or something. And so it makes it very unsafe. And so far, no one has been able to develop a gunpowder fingerprinting method that does not have that risk along with it. And mainly no one's been able to develop it because the people who would develop it, gunpowder companies, they don't want it because it's going to really complicate their ammunition manufacturing. If this technology ever became viable, then it would make it very difficult for them to manufacture ammunition, and it doesn't work unless you register ammunition sales. It's interesting that you knew about that. I'm surprised. Do you recall where you heard about that?
No, I don't.
I never learned about it until right after the Boston Marathon bombing. I think those two guys, the Tsarnaev brothers, who perpetrated the Boston Marathon bombing, I think they used fireworks, and they used the powder out of the fireworks in their pressure cooker bombs. But right after it happened, some politician was like, I'm going to get on my soapbox. And he's like, if only we had gunpowder fingerprinting, then we could have investigated this faster or something. Except they didn't use gunpowder. Gunpowder is commonly used in pressure cooker bombs, but also just whatever random powder comes out of fireworks is popular too. But that's where I originally learned about it.
They caught them pretty fast, didn't they? So I don't see how that would have made much of a difference either.
Yeah, they caught them because the Tsarnaevs were a couple of idiots. They were like, yeah, we could just bomb this marathon and then just go home and hang out. In fact, like, they went to a party the next night or something. They They absolutely did not take seriously the thought that someone might investigate and try to figure out who did it. They had no plan for eluding capture.
I didn't realize that.
Because they just thought no one would ever figure out who it was.
Maybe they just thought bombs were completely anonymous and untraceable.
Yeah.
Are they?
No, not at all, because you can always do tool mark analysis on all the parts of them. So there's a similar kind of technology to gunpowder fingerprinting, and it's called explosive taggants. And so it's a method of adding this material into explosives so that when they're detonated, they bust this material apart and spray it all over the place. And so this was a program that the ATF got a couple of explosives manufacturers to go along with in, I believe, the late 70s. And it was a short-lived program because it's hard to solve crimes. And, I mean, bombings were a big problem in the 70s in the US, but by the end of the 70s, it was getting under control. And then into the 80s, it wasn't that big of a deal. And by the mid-80s, the companies didn't want to go along with it anymore because, again, they have to keep all these records of who they're selling particular lots of explosives to and everything so that it'll be traceable. And it just wasn't worth it. There was no law requiring this to happen. They were just voluntarily doing it at the ATF's request. And so they stopped participating in the 80s. Mm-hmm. But the way it worked is you would manufacture this material. And if you imagine very, very thin sheets of plastic laminated together, and each sheet is a different color. And so by varying the order of the colors and which colors, you can encode a bunch of information. And so they would do this, and some of the information that would be encoded was the manufacturer, the lot number, the type of explosive, and enough other information to trace it so that the manufacturer at least could go back to their records, trace it to a distributor, to a retailer, to a retail buyer. And the top layer of this taggant material would be a reflective material so that at a crime scene, somebody would see this like reflective dust laying everywhere and recognize what it is. And then the bottom layer of the taggant material was a ferrous material so that you could pick it up with a magnet real easy. So you could collect it for analysis. And so there was actually at least one crime solved using explosive taggant analysis. In the 1970s, there was a guy who blew up his brother-in-law's truck, I think, killed his brother-in-law. For some reason, it was some vendetta he had, and they solved the crime using taggant analysis. And to my knowledge, that's the only crime ever solved with it. But it was kind of a short-lived program, and, over the last, mainly through the 1970s, because of, like, the underground bombing campaigns and things, it became much harder to acquire explosives in the U.S. In the late 60s and the early 70s, you could just literally walk into stores that sold explosives, like hardware or construction vendors, and buy them without presenting an ID. But they all voluntarily clamped down on that during the 70s.
So I guess if people just have ready, easy access to explosives, then there's a lot of explosives-related crimes.
I don't know. For a long time, there weren't, though. I mean, explosives production was industrialized, like in the 1800s?
Yeah.
And yet, explosives crimes didn't explode until the 1970s.
Why was that?
So there was this political movement that grew out of the end of kind of the hippie anti-war movement in the late 1960s. And it was it's kind of referred to as the radical underground movement. And eventually their preferred way of making a statement and getting attention so that they could then deliver a press release was to blow something up. And so there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bombings by these groups every year in the US in the early 70s. They were particularly active in New York and Philadelphia and San Francisco and a couple of other cities, mostly East and West Coast.
So it wasn't like explosive related attacks went up in general. It was like specifically people motivated, or people in this cause like cared about it more.
Yeah. So I guess what you're trying to say is that people related to this cause generated all the new attacks.
Yeah. Because, yeah, why weren't there a bunch of explosive attacks in the 30s? You could blow stuff up or probably make mail bombs in the 30s.
And there were some, but it didn't become an epidemic enough to enact these further restrictions until the 70s. Because there's always like that popular image of like some Prohibition era gangster throwing a bomb through a window, right?
Yeah. I remember seeing an educational video. I can't remember what decade it was shot in, but it was for kids, and it was like, what to do if you find blasting caps laying around. And it was mostly, don't play with them. And then they showed a blasting cap blowing up a watermelon. And I was just thinking, I've never seen a blasting cap in my entire life. For people who don't know, they basically look like a black cat firework, which is that tiny little firework that has a little fuse coming out of it. Except a blasting cap is like this whole order of destructiveness past a black cat. I mean, it's really like two, 3 orders of magnitude more powerful. It's incredibly powerful. And they were like, kids, don't just screw around with these. It'll blow your hand off. And after seeing them test detonate them, I was like, I believe you. But I guess this is a thing where boys adventuring around their neighborhood, maybe in the 50s, I don't know, would just encounter these regularly. Oh, it's the neighbor's collection of blasting caps. I don't know.
I've got some C4 I found last week. Let's see what we can do.
Apparently, crates of dynamite in mines was another thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny because there's a movie called Heat with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And in one of the early scenes, Val Kilmer's character just walks into this like construction supply business and buys a bunch of explosives. And he like shows a fake ID, I think. And the movie was filmed in 1993. And I think by 1993, it was already much harder to buy explosives than just walking in and showing a fake ID.
What did they use those explosives for in the movie?
To blow the back door off of that armor car.
Oh, okay.
That they robbed as the first heist in the movie.
I remembered watching the movie with you, but I didn't remember explosives. But okay.
Yeah. So it's an interesting subject overall, because all of the techniques have merit, and they kind of work. But there's a lot of caveats, and none of them are as easy as CSI has led everyone to believe over the last 20 years.
Are you familiar with lead content analysis?
Is it just like an isotope analysis, or specifically an alloy analysis?
I thought it was chemically based, so probably not isotopes. But it was something that the FBI did for a while, where they would analyze the lead content of bullets, and then the lead content of bullets recovered at a suspect's home. And then they would try to match them, but it was found to mostly be bad science. The matches were not as accurate as they portrayed them to be in the courtroom. And so a bunch of people have been freed from jail after being convicted, largely based on lead content analysis.
So that's interesting, because what I would initially suspect is that almost all manufacturers would just use the same lead alloy.
Yeah.
And I know that, for instance, like a 98-2 mix is very popular. So it's 90% lead, and then I think it's 8% tin and 2% antimony. I don't know what that element is, but it's like the extra 2% thing is for like a lot more hardness, even though it's lead. But that's a very common lead alloy that's used for bullets. And I would have suspected that kind of forensic analysis would fall to the fact that probably a couple of companies in the United States make most or all of the lead wire that is used to make bullets.
I think they were portraying it as there's tiny variances, but we can detect them.
Oh, that's terrible.
I mean, that's what tool mark analysis comes down to, right? You would think, oh, every tool is the same, and it's like, well, actually not, if you can look closely enough.
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing to point out here. It's that in forensic analysis, you have these two broad types of characteristics when you look at something. You have the characteristics that every example of that thing will have, and then you have the unique characteristics that individual examples will have. And so a good way of explaining this is footprint analysis. So you have a crime scene and the suspect left a shoe print, and they do a plaster mold of it, and they have a negative of the shoe print then. And the sole pattern of the shoe print will tell them what the make and size of the shoe was. But that does not uniquely distinguish it from any other of the millions of shoe of that type that were manufactured. But there will be other characteristics, like this person walks with a lot of like extra pressure on the front inside of their step, or they wear their shoes way too long and they're beat up in a certain unique way. And so there will be that additional level of characteristics on top that help you identify it more uniquely. And so it sounds like that lead analysis was only capable of detecting those elements that were part of just the standard manufacturing and not really any unique type of property. And so they were representing it as being capable of doing that, but it wasn't.
Yeah, I believe so. I didn't do my research on it beforehand, because I just thought about it just now. So in summary, what is your advice for people who want to commit a crime with a gun?
Buy a gun with cash in a face-to-face transaction with no paperwork several years before you want to commit the crime. Then do not shoot the gun ever until you're committing the crime. When you go to commit the crime, use ammunition that you bought over the counter for cash several years ago that is different than any other ammunition you may own. Different in bullet weight for the caliber and different in manufacturer. Preferably, the gun and the ammunition should be in a caliber that you don't own any other guns for. Ideally, you will have saved enough of this ammunition to simply load the gun to capacity once and thrown the rest of it in a river years before. Then when you complete the commission of the crime, you throw the gun in the river too. That's the best I can do.
Why do you have to never fire the gun before?
I actually saw a case where a guy was caught because they recovered a bullet that he fired into a tree on his own property, just in his backyard shooting a gun. And so they suspected that he was the killer in some case. So they had a bullet recovered from the autopsy of a victim, and they needed something to compare it against, but they didn't know if the guy even owned a gun of this type. But they did have knowledge from someone else that he occasionally shot guns in his backyard. And so they got a court order to go and basically cut his trees down and take bullets out of them and examine those bullets. So you would never fire it in order to circumvent that opportunity.
I'm really impressed at the level of detecting going on there. That's some good detective work. I don't know if I would have come up with cut the trees down unless I was given a whole lot of time.
They used a metal detector on them first.
Yeah, I figured.
So they didn't just cut down all the trees.
Maybe that's like a common thing. It's like you go to some class to learn to be a detective, and they're like, here are places where bullets can be found or something, and you don't have to do all the thinking yourself. But that's still pretty impressive.
Send Craig your guns you want to get rid of.